you had something to say?
You spoke earlier about how rules of engagement and the Geneva Convention get thrown out the window, but what kind of training did you have before going to Iraq about the Geneva Convention or about rules of engagement?
Well, my unit went to Kosovo for 9 months before we went to Iraq.
Mine too.
The Geneva Conventions were heavily stressed, strict rules of engagement were emphasized. We did a lot of training before we went to Kosovo. When we came back, those rules of engagement were loosened. We no longer mentioned much about the Geneva Conventions, but we did do a lot of classroom stuff about rules of engagement, and then when we were in the field, we did a lot of like role-playing situational stuff of what to do and what not to do. I found myself in Iraq shooting at ambulances and medical personnel, Iraqi medical personnel. We were not supposed to touch mosques or raid mosques. They had the snipers actually raid a mosque in the middle of the night by ourselves without the rest of the unit's knowledge, so we could accomplish that task without apparently breaking the Geneva Conventions. We used high caliber weapons on civilians that were supposed to be designated for vehicle combat. We had plenty of white phosphorus that the mortars used, white phosphorus rounds, which is a weapon banned to be used against human targets. It's only supposed to be used on vehicles or burning field and vegetation and stuff like that. Yeah, I don't know, the list goes on and on. Obviously, treatment of detainees was horrible. The raids that Mark was telling you about, where we'd go in and kick in the door, we actually had a checklist of kind of a flow chart of how to detain people, and there was different categories. We used to put sandbags over people's heads and tie them off, and we had chalk, and we'd make a chalk mark on the bag of what category detainee they was. The first category was if they had any sort of contraband, like weapon or Al-Qaeda paraphernalia or whatever they wanted to call it. Then he would get a bag and he'd be A. If they didn't have their identification card, they'd be B. If they did have their identification card, didn't have any contraband, but didn't live in the house, they were category C. And many a times, because it was basically privates and specialists oftentimes doing this grunt work, if we had an Iraqi who was resisting, or Iraqi that would mouth off or say something that didn't sound appropriate, or wouldn't cooperate, showing us different things in the house, oftentimes their C's often became A's, and we would just take them to the base and we dump them off to military intelligence, and sometimes the appropriate contraband came with them, and sometimes it got misplaced, and this guy would just show up with an A on his head, so he was obviously some sort of Iraqi with some contraband he was not supposed to have, and that guy would disappear, and he'd just move on to another base and get transported by the military police to another location, oftentimes Abu Ghraib, where all he is a guy with an A on his head. Nobody knows his name, nobody knows where he came from. All they know is that he was a bad guy, and they want to find out why, so they're going to torture him and try to figure out why he had contraband and figure out where he's from and what he was doing. So just very, very simple choices by individual soldiers who's having a bad day in Iraq can affect somebody's life in very drastic ways.
At least your unit filled out paperwork. At the beginning of the war, I mean, like I said, there would be days where we were looking for something to do, so our sergeants would have us, we would raid these whole blocks. I already spoke about that, but what we would do with these soldiers, we didn't guard them. We would merely take them to a little outpost, a little base set up, and we would hand all these guys, all right, we got 30 guys we just threw in the back of a pickup, in the back of Humvees, and we're dropping them off. What'd they do? Oh, we don't know. Do you know they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were in this house, or there was a...
Doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. We didn't need justification to drop them off. We wouldn't fill out paperwork. We wouldn't know these guys' names, didn't have ID cards, anything like that was set up, and we would just drop them off, and we stopped worrying about it. So I don't know what happened to all those people, if they ended up in jail, if they were set free, if they were killed, and they don't have phones. A lot of families don't have cell phones like we do, so it's not like they can just pick up the phone, call their wife, and say, "It's okay, I'll be back in a week."
It's not like calling CJC for your brother-in-law. You know?
Right. So we never saw those men again, and I just have a hard time dealing with that, knowing that our actions changed the lives of every single one of those men and boys who we hauled away.
Keep in mind, in the first Gulf War, tens of thousands of Iraqi soldiers gave themselves up. And oftentimes, there was even situations where like thousands of Iraqis were giving themselves up to cameramen of news stations. That's because they thought that they would be treated fairly and justly in confinement within the U.S. military's structure.
Being a prisoner was a better life than being an Iraq soldier.
In that situation, that was very likely. Now, after Abu Ghraib, I was in Iraq when Abu Ghraib was exposed. We found that many times those the same Iraqis would fight to the death instead of surrender, and we lost a lot of men trying to get these guys out of little ditches and holes and houses, because they would not quit fighting, because they would rather die than end up in Abu Ghraib or someplace worse like that.